Hey kids, gather in the glow of your favorite device. Grandpa wants to tell some road stories. Now, way back in the before times, pre-plague, I did the stand-up comedy thing. Made a living at it for about 10 years, then kept doing it for another 5 because I didn't have any other marketable skills. Now, in almost 2 decades of being intentionally funny, I dealt with a lot of drunks, assholes, and attention-starved jerks. And the audience members were just as bad. Now, I was never a fan of hecklers. Sure, I could eviscerate an overserved rando if necessary, but if I spent 10 minutes babysitting someone who thought they were just helping the show, that was 10 minutes of my act I couldn't do. See, most of us work hours, days, and weeks to develop jokes that make paying audiences laugh, and most of us would rather not deal with the bullshit, even if your girlfriend or the guys in your frat think you're funny. And real talk, your girlfriend doesn't actually think you're that funny. Problems in the audience usually come from individual guys, but the worst groups to deal with as a comic would have to be bachelorette parties. Now, bachelor parties who stumble into a comedy club between titty bars are usually manageable because they're guys and they know that in a couple hours they'll see more naked women. But I would rather do stand-up in front of Al Qaeda than a bachelorette party. Any group of more than 6 women wearing novelty penis hats and drinking out of fish bowls is trouble for a comedian, especially if you're a male comedian, which I usually was. If you're a male comic, you can't get too harsh with a group of women, no matter how deserving, without seeming like, I don't know, you're trying to reinforce the patriarchy or something. So I'm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, at a club called Hollywood's. Now, side note, to my knowledge, there is not a club in Hollywood called Cedar Rapids. It's the 4th of July weekend, and the owner takes the comics out on his boat on a lake or river or some body of water. I may not remember my eastern Iowa geography, but I do remember we all got hammered on the boat. This was partly because the owner told us, and this is important to the story, he didn't think we would have a show that night, figuring there wouldn't be much of a crowd. Then, about a half hour before the show was supposed to open, as we were dragging our asses off the boat, he decided, you know what, let's do a show and just see who shows up. This was not ideal. The only people wandering the streets of downtown Cedar Rapids that night were drunker than we were, and they weren't exactly invested in a comedy show, including a group of 10 or 12, who knows, it might have been 40 or 50, very drunk, very loud women having a, you guessed it, bachelorette party. Oh, and they wanted to sit at a long banquet table right next to the stage. The first comic goes up and tries to get the bachelorettes to be somewhat aware of the fact that a show was happening, but they didn't seem to mind. Then the MC did a highly technical maneuver known in the business as bailing, just gave up and introduced me, the headliner. Of course, the club enforced a 2-drink minimum, so the women had gotten drunker at that point, and I made a fateful decision. I turned my back on the entire group and performed the rest of my show to 3 very uncomfortable couples. Apparently, the young ladies, who didn't want to listen to my act when I started, really didn't want to be ignored, because they went from festive to furious and started yelling at me, or rather, started yelling at my back, because at this point, I had doubled down on my strategy and was literally pretending like they weren't there. At this point, the 3 pleasant Midwestern couples who I decided were the audience naturally wanted to leave, because a clearly insane man was now focusing all of his attention on them. Over by the edge of the stage, I noticed the MC gesturing at me, but in that moment, I just thought he was really into the show, so I kept going. And he kept gesturing. And I kept going. Finally, he actually came on the stage and walked over to me, and I'm thinking, this is a weird time to do improv. Instead, he whispered, "You have to get off the stage." And he pointed to the owner, who was definitely not into my show. For some weird reason, I actually thanked everyone for coming, always the professional, and I said goodnight. I never worked Cedar Rapids, Iowa again. That's showbiz, people.